This project has a lot of pieces to it, not just making the wine bottle grid, but also the doors, the drawer boxes, the wine glass holders, and of course the cabinet itself. The video is bookmarked, so feel free to jump around if you're only interested in certain aspects of the project. I did break out making the wine cork and epoxy top into its own separate video, and I'll include a link to that in the video description. My low budget circular saw and straight edge work fine for breaking down the plywood. I'm using 3/4 inch cherry plywood, which has a pretty thin outer veneer. So I find that if I first make one really shallow pass and then I come back and cut all the way through, that it avoids tearing out the outer veneer and makes a pretty clean cut. Although those cuts are just to rough sizes, then I go to the table saw and make all of my final cuts. I used SketchUp to create the design before I started, and I also created a complete cut list in advance, which makes pretty quick work of breaking down the plywood. And after I have all of the panels cut to size, I move on to applying the edge banding. I'm just using the iron-on stuff. It's real wood, it's just cut really thin, and it's pretty easy to apply with the household iron. These trimming tools made specifically for this type of edge banding are really inexpensive and easy to use. I'll leave links in the description for these, as well as a bunch of other stuff that I'm using in this video. With some light sanding to take off the edge, the panels look great. Next is to install a dado stack on my table saw and start cutting all of the dado joints for the shelves. Most of these cuts are pretty straightforward, and to ensure alignment, I cut each side with the same saw setting. However, there are a couple of cuts where the reference point for one side of the shelf is different than the other side of the shelf, and getting the groove cut exactly at the right spot is a bit tricky. So I just nick the wood at first, double check the alignment. It's not quite right, so I bump the fence a little bit till it's just perfect. To cut the rabbet joints, sometimes I'll use the dado stack and a sacrificial fence on my table saw. Or if it's a more shallow cut, like for the back panel of the cabinet, then a router is sometimes just easier. The construction of this cabinet is kind of similar to kitchen cabinets, but this is a piece of furniture that needs to be sturdy enough to be picked up and moved around. So lots of dado joints, screws, glues, and clamps. And just a simple jig for some pocket holes for the spreaders works great. When I remove all the clamps, the whole assembly is super rigid and sturdy, and I'm stoked. To dress up the cabinet a little bit, I add a skirt to it, or I don't know, maybe you call it a toe kick. I'm just making this out of solid cherry and adding a simple round over. And after first getting the miter joints to fit just right, then I can mark and cut the length of the side pieces to fit perfect. To make it look a little bit more like a piece of furniture that has legs, I use a bandsaw to add some detail to it. And then I attach it to the cabinet with some glue and a lot of clamps. Moving on to make the wine bottle rack, I'm using solid cherry. First, I straighten up one edge on the joiner, and then I make the other edge parallel on the table saw. I'm going to be using the thin rip jig on the table saw. These slats will be 3/4 inches wide, and a thin rip jig isn't really necessary. I could have just cut these between the blade and the fence. But for me, it just feels more comfortable and safer to do it this way. If you don't already have a thin rip jig for your table saw, I highly recommend it. There are a lot of different ones out there. I'm not sure that one's any better than the other, but I'll leave a link to the one that I use in the description if you're interested. Before I cut the slots to length, I give them all a good sanding just because I think it seems easier to work with longer work pieces. And then set up the router table to put a small chamfer on two sides of every piece. Chamfer or bevel, I'm not sure, whatever you want to call it. Using feather boards is definitely the way to go for these types of cuts on the router table. These look pretty cool. I could probably make one of those slat walls out of these, but that's another project. So after setting up a stop block on my miter saw, I just chop away until they're all cut to the proper length. Cutting the vertical stiles on the table saw is pretty straightforward. I had this idea to create a jig or a form, whatever you want to call it, and I fiddled around with it for way too long, not sure how well it really worked anyway. The purpose is to make sure that each rack gets assembled straight and square and that all the racks end up being the same width. I guess it worked okay. I got the result I was looking for, but I gotta believe there's a better way. Some of the rails get installed directly under the walls of the cabinet. And then here, I'm just doing a test fit with some temporary spacers just to make sure it all fits properly. Before mounting these permanently, I'm going to stain and finish them, which is coming up here in a few minutes. Cut these rails and stiles for the doors off camera. Figured you'd seen enough of me using the table saw and miter saw for this video. These router bit sets for cutting basic shaker style doors are great. I invested in one of these a couple years ago. I've used it numerous times and I really like it. The first step is to cut a groove on the inside of all of the stiles and all of the rails. After the grooves are all cut, then I change to the matching router bit that cuts the tongues. It's a little bit tricky to get the height exactly right, so a practice piece is a good idea. And even though it has a roller guide, I like having the fence set as well to be exactly the right depth. These cuts for all of the rails are cross grain, and I'm a little nervous about tear out, so I batch them all together, and I also run a scrap piece through butt up against the last one. The center panel for the doors is quarter-inch thick, and all I have is this three-quarter-inch cherry. So I use the bandsaw to resaw some of the pieces into thinner work pieces. And then I glue them up into a larger panel. After the glue dries on that, I use the planer to dial in the thickness to exactly the quarter-inch that I'm looking for. Cutting the three panels down to final size is pretty straightforward, and then the doors are ready for assembly. Cabinet doors are pretty affordable to buy pre made from any number of online sources, and yeah, they're all professional quality. But for a project like this where I'm just making everything, it just seems more fun and genuine to just make them myself. And finally, just some quick sanding to finish the doors, and they look great. Making the drawer box from some half-inch cherry plywood. After cutting all of the panels, then I install a half-inch dado stack on the table saw and get out my trusty box joint cutting jig that I made a couple years ago. It's a bit tedious going through both ends of each panel, but really goes a lot quicker than you might think. Then I cut a groove along the inside of the side panels for the bottom panel to fit into. When I cut the groove on the front and back panels, I don't want that groove to show, so I use these pencil lines that I made on the fence as a guide and carefully start and stop the cut short of each end. And a rabbet cut along all of the edges of the bottom panel, and it's ready for assembly. The blue tape here is just to control the glue squeeze out on the inside corners, and I remove it while the glue is still wet. A quick sanding of all the joints, and the drawer came out great. Except that then I discovered it was the wrong size. I have no idea what went wrong here, but honestly, I make mistakes like this all the time. So I'm faced with two choices. One is to remake the drawer box, or two is to cut some shims to mount the drawer glides on. And I decide to go with the route of using the shims. The wine glass holders is the last component to make before assembling the whole thing. This is a tricky cut on the table saw, so I'm going to use a piece of scrap wood and some double sided tape to make the workpiece much larger and safer for the table saw. Some of the wine glass holder pieces are single sided, like this one, and some are double sided, but I use the same jig and the same saw setting for both. And once the angles are cut, then I fine tune the thickness on the planer. Here I'm just gluing on a straight piece to create a little offset on the wine glass holder. After cutting the pieces down to final length, they're all finished up and look pretty good. I'm staining and finishing all of the pieces together before final assembly. Cherry can get really blotchy when applying a dark stain if you're not careful. The process that I'm using here is the best that I've found at getting a blotch free dark stain on cherry. I made a separate video on how to do this, so I won't go into too many details here. The first step is to seal the grain with shellac, which will help the stain go on more uniform and reduce the blotchiness. Then I apply a gel stain. I probably should have finished all the little pieces of these wine bottle racks before putting them together, but I wanted the glue to bond strongly to the bare wood. I'm not sure that was the best choice. I could have just used an epoxy instead of wood glue, probably would have been plenty strong enough even after finishing it. The final step in the finishing process is to apply a tinted lacquer. It requires several coats of lacquer, but I only put the tint in the first coat. Here you can see as I'm turning over the doors how the tinted lacquer adds uniformity and a non blotchy color to the finish. Between each coat of lacquer, I sand it with 320 grit sandpaper. Or in some places, I use a very fine steel wool where there are a lot of corners. I don't want to risk the sandpaper nicking the stain below the lacquer. I did 3 coats of lacquer in total, with the tinted lacquer only in the first coat and the second 2 coats just clear lacquer. It's time for final assembly. I mount the wine bottle racks with some screws and with the help of the spacer blocks that I had cut earlier. I really like this jig that I have for the concealed hinges. Makes it super easy and accurate. And getting the drawer glides mounted, this thing is coming together nicely. I did a separate video on how to make the wine cork and epoxy top, which was a whole project in itself. And at this point, I can't resist trying it out while still in the shop just to see how everything fits. And I'm stoked at how it all came together. Thanks so much for watching.